right, let's get started. We're on the hour. Thanks everyone for joining us today to dive in on a discussion about data access and differential privacy. I am joined by my distinguished colleagues that I will introduce in just a minute. But I wanted to note just how we got to this point right now. Over the course of the last year, Recurve, with the help of our DOE and NREL sponsors and roughly 12 industry experts, gathered together to explore the policy ramifications of the technical work that Recurve had done in prior years to apply differential privacy to energy consumption data. And today is an opportunity for us to discuss this work in context and with the support of 3 industry experts, 2 of whom served on the technical advisory group, Chris Villarreal from Plugged In Strategies and Michael Murray from Mission Data, and 1 who did not. And that would be David Littell of the Regulatory Assistance Project, who today will offer up kind of a fresh take on how this differential privacy guide may be used. So by way of format, we're first going to hear from our panelists, and then I'm going to give an overview of the guide and a specific example of how it was applied. And then we'll circle back to a discussion with the panelists and be able to take some questions and answers from the audience as well. So with that, I'd like to first hand it over to our first panelist, Michael Murray, to give some quick takes.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen. I'm Michael Murray with Mission Data Coalition, and we're a nonprofit organization that has primarily focused on the consent-driven aspects of sharing your energy and usage and billing data with, say, an energy management company. And what's, I think, really important about this report, especially for those of you who may not be familiar with these issues, is that we increasingly get a lot of questions about unconsented data exchanges. So, there's a certain level of, privacy and cybersecurity protection that's reasonable to apply when the customer is knowingly, entering into a data sharing relationship of some sort. But everybody agrees that there's a different set of standards that should apply when there is no customer consent. So for example, if a utility company needs to use your information to share it with their contractors or vendors to perform some sort of purpose, whether there's research agendas that could advance energy policy in different states that you don't want to have to, get the individual consent for, hundreds or thousands or millions of people. So there's although my background is more on the consent side of this equation, I think it's really important that this report provides a really robust and sort of mathematically rigorous take on the unconsented side of this. Those of you may be familiar with various aggregation thresholds, and I think there's, for example, the 15-15 threshold. If you just have 15 or so, customers together and you add up their energy usage into one number, then, if that number is high enough, then maybe it's okay to publicly release that information. And I think what this report really gets at is that that's kind of an obsolete and, dare I say, lazy approach to actually determining what is the risk of harm. And so I think this report provides a really thoughtful balance of probing these issues of individual privacy, different mathematical approaches to address those, while simultaneously trying to get some of the public benefit value of the unconsented analysis of energy data.
Thank you, Michael. Let's turn it over to Chris Villarreal from Plugged In Strategies.
Good afternoon or good morning. Thank you, Carmen, for asking me to participate today. I'm Chris Villarreal of Plugged In Strategies. I am an independent consultant that works with state regulators and with clean energy advocates before the states, working on issues associated with the modern grid and grid modernization writ large. So my background is I was former staff at the California PUC, and one of the proceedings that I participated in was the development of the California PUC data access and privacy rules, which were adopted in 2012. And I also participated in the development of the Department of Energy's DataGuard voluntary framework to assist states and utilities to understand and try to apply good practices on ensuring that customer usage information is appropriately protected, but also ways in which they can be enabled. And so building on something that Michael said, making available this type of information that is not so highly aggregated to be really hard to use, but not so granular that you risk identifying an individual customer, was really one of the challenges that that we've had to talk about in many of the states that I've worked in, including California. And being able to develop data sets that provide the public and users and stakeholders with enough information about the system, about usage, about location, without negatively impacting customer privacy, is where this concept of differential privacy really does provide a lot of benefit. As Michael noted, existing aggregation methodologies really don't work as it applies to broader sets of data. And so there really is a need to figure out what are the better ways of making data available in ways that do not violate or harm customer privacy. And providing the information in a way that differential privacy can provide it can provide a lot of benefit to the market, to third parties, to consumers, to utilities, and to the public about how usage is being done across the system, provide better information to developers, policymakers, and other stakeholders to target and develop programs that can really provide benefits to the public and to consumers across states as more and more information can be available through the development of things like advanced metering infrastructure. And the last thing I'll just note about differential privacy, as also as it applies to data privacy and data access, is that there is no one methodology to rule them all. There really is a need to understand the differences in aggregation methodologies, because every aggregation request is going to be different. It'll be different on scope, on scale, and across geography. And it becomes really difficult to try to use one methodology to handle all the disparate and different ways in which data can be aggregated, collected, and provided. And so having a framework built around something like differential privacy, as the report outlines, is a way to help push across and get through those challenges of working with one data aggregation methodology to actually make data available and used and useful for the public. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to participating.
Thanks, Chris. Hand it over to you, David, from the Regulatory Assistance Project.
Thanks. I want to take a step back. So I noticed we were up to 41. We're now down to 37. If anyone's listening to all the detail here, I want to take a step back to why this is important. I mean, one, I work on this with a lot of states, actually with Michael and Chris in some of those states, but this is an issue that all energy regulators need to deal with. They may not want to, but it's sort of an omnipresent issue, and it's about much more than privacy. It's about the fact that there's a lot of data out there being generated, and they need to think about how they're going to regulate it. And it's as much about access to and development of private markets for all of these advanced energy technologies as it is about privacy. But obviously we need to make sure that we're protecting customer privacy in doing that. And this guide is, I thank you for asking me to do this, because you gave me a reason to read this guide. Even though I work in the area, I read it twice and I got, a lot out of it each time. But this guide is really helpful. It's not just Recurve does a lot of the cutting edge work in this area, but this guide and work was funded by the US DOE and NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, because they understand how important this is for the current and future development of the grid. So this sort of has that public facing aspect too. So we've got experts in Recurve that do a lot of the cutting edge work here on how to use advanced technology, and some of the folks, Michael and Chris, who've worked on it. But it's a very, very important framework. So I would encourage you all to take a look and to present this to regulatory staff, commissioners, of which I was one. I can tell you of the 230 public utility commissioners, more or less, in the country, probably less than 5 have any background in this type of data management, if that. Staff on commissions, probably more than 5, but still, it is not a qualification on which utility analysts or commissioners are picked. But it's not that hard. You can get into it, and we'll talk about how to get into it and understand it. It's not as hard as depreciation. It's not as hard as integrated resource planning. It's not as hard as many things that commissions do every day. We just need to understand it. The reason why it's not going away is because data management is part of our 21st century economy. I mean, we all know that. Like my first smartphone 15 years ago, when it asked me to share my data, I sort of had this knee jerk, of course I'm not going to share my data with anyone, right? But then I discovered all the apps didn't work if I didn't share my data. I was stuck in traffic and the traffic app wouldn't work. So you learn that. And I think we're early in that stage where customers don't even know what they're missing if we don't facilitate data management. And the important thing to understand here is often regulators wait for utilities to bring things to them. But in this case, and I'm here as a senior advisor of the Regulatory Assistance Project, I also work with private clients in my law practice. And with those private clients, I will advise them not to share data because it's not rational. And if you're a utility, you don't want to share data with your competitors. So regulators are really sort of in the cusp of this area where you can't rely on the entities giving away their very valuable customer data and other data for nothing. And regulators need to push the envelope a little bit. And this guide shows some very innovative ways to deal with a privacy issue that's often thrown up as a problem in sharing it. And so it really advances it, and appreciate this opportunity to talk with you all about it. And right after this, later in the day, I'm going to send something out to some other state people I'm working with on a solution to another problem we had that's very data driven that was suggested to me by reading this document. So I commend it to all of you.
Great, thank you, David. I also realized that I neglected to introduce myself at the beginning. So I'm Carmen Best, I'm the VP of Policy and Emerging Markets, and I really appreciate your sentiments, David, because I am one of those people that has learned it as I have gone. Recurve's interest in this topic is we have positioned ourselves as a settlement platform in the demand response and energy efficiency and DER space. And in order to do that, we have to be custodians of large amounts of data and utilize them responsibly to deliver best practices in measurement quantification approaches, but also in optimization and other strategies that can help build the grid and bring these resources forward. So all of our work is also, we strive to do it in a transparent and open way and make it accessible to the market, because together we can build out these markets that are going to help all boats kind of rise to the top and answer some of the biggest questions in this energy transition that we have today. So with that, I'd like to switch to the overview of the guide itself. And clearly we need to start with the biggest question. What is differential privacy? So thank you, gentlemen, for those insights to really get us started. And we'll tackle this big question right here. In a nutshell, differential privacy is a mathematical technique to add noise to a data set to reduce the risk of any individual being re-identified. And even if they are re-identified, the information that might be exposed about them may be limited or more limited. So adding noise to a data set is a little bit different than, it's a different way to protect customer data than simply anonymizing or aggregating data sets to conceal the identity of individuals in the data set. And you'll find this in the literature, but anonymization and aggregation techniques really offer what we call a binary protection, meaning that when they do fail and you cross that line, they fail completely and a lot of information can be released. Whereas differential privacy can be deployed to provide scaled protection based on the amount of noise that's injected into the data set. So we can find its application in our daily lives already. Google's mobility reports that were generated to inform public health policies for COVID use differential privacy to protect individual re-identification. And even our 2020 US Census is now utilizing differential privacy for their data products as well. So even though differential privacy is commonly used in other contexts, it's not particularly relevant or prevalent in the conversations about protecting energy consumption data. Most energy data access frameworks call out anonymization or aggregation as the techniques to protect data. And there are a range of reasons why differential privacy hasn't really been included to date, but that doesn't preclude it from being considered going forward, especially as it becomes a mainstream practice. So why might differential privacy be useful? Well, it offers a more flexible and robust means of protecting consumer privacy. It can help us optimize usability versus just re-identification risk for particular use cases. It can provide a mathematical framework to express this balance point in potentially one number. And it can protect against re-identification, especially when you're considering the use of hourly load shapes, which is becoming more and more important. And it could also minimize the amount of data requests that are required and offer better privacy protection with improved usability. Finally, most data access frameworks are trying to find a balance between customer privacy and data access. And we think that differential privacy is an elegant resolution in many different use cases. But as noted, it's not the only one. So our goal for the guide then was to empower stakeholders and decision makers to understand how differential privacy can fit into existing or emerging energy data access frameworks, and in particular, how it could be positioned alongside the currently dominant protection techniques like anonymization and aggregation. So we structured the guide in 5 simple chapters. The first, each of them have a defined learning goal and have ample references. And they cover first the history and context of data access, the existing frameworks for data access, the fundamentals for assessing risk and harm, defining use cases, and ultimately choosing a privacy factor. So the privacy factor is the equivalent of how much noise you're adding to a data set to protect it when you're using differential privacy. All of this work was coupled with the complementary tool that Recurve developed called the Energy Differential Privacy Explorer, which was designed to operationalize these discussions and in particular visualize the impact on potential usability of data, depending on how much noise was added to the data set. Big thanks to Mariano Tejan for the interface development and to Mark Pare, who initially developed the open source libraries that supported the tool development in the first place. So the idea for this guide was really to offer an off-the-shelf resource for regulators, stakeholders, and practitioners to engage in a meaningful and useful discussion on data protection from day one. The other contribution to that day one conversation was offering a systematic way to review data sharing context and the risks associated with it. Proceedings that address data access inevitably have to consider what data is being used for, who is using the data, how the data is held or shared, and ultimately how risky the release of data may be. And as many of us know, these conversations can go sideways very quickly, sometimes from wanton risk mongering or excessive use case virtue signaling, or sometimes both. And ultimately, they can block the meaningful discussion of techniques that can help balance between risk and usability. So in this guide, we applied this 5-step approach that we borrowed from the book called Building an Anonymization Pipeline to help us consider the context, risk, and trade-offs in a systematic way. It's adapted from the healthcare industry, and it offers a point-to-point decomposition of intended use cases and potential risk profiles within those use cases. So in looking at the technical aspects of applying differential privacy, it mostly boils down to these last 2 steps. But you'll see in the guide that it generally needs to be recognized and understood as an option early in the policy framework so that it can be properly understood and deployed further down the chain. So now I'd like to walk you through an example of a use case that is highlighted in the guide, but it was actually used in practice. Recurve recently completed a study with the California ISO in which we utilized differential privacy to protect against re-identification of non-participants in the data set. In this case, the California ISO didn't have access to customer level consumption data to operationalize their own comparison group method that was approved in their tariff. So Recurve was able to serve as the intermediary and protect non-participant data that was provided from several load serving entities who had donated this non-participant data under non-disclosure agreement or NDA for the purposes of the research. So I'm going to walk you through how we applied the 5 safes assessment and then ultimately the optimization strategy for privatizing results in the report. So we start with the project itself. What is the scenario for needing the data and the context for using the data? In most use cases, this is inherently where the moral justification has to come in. It's kind of a threshold question. And in this case, the CAISO wanted to operationalize its own tariff, like I noted, to see what demand response impacts from 2020 extreme heat events look like with a comparison group methodology as opposed to their typical 10 and 10 baselines. With the advent of FERC 2222, which requires DERs to be considered by ISOs, and the need to use methodological best practices for assessing demand side impacts, this seems like a pretty justifiable case to consider. And it's core information for managing and operating the grid. So it seems to hit that test of, is it justified? But it still comes with some legal and ethical boundaries that have to be considered and are listed on the right-hand side. So you're working through those systematically. You can understand how and where the next steps are going to come into play. So the next category that we cover is safe people. And this is really intended to understand who's in the system, can we trust them or not? So who do we have here? First and foremost, we have the source of the key data, which is the load serving entity and the demand response provider. Then we have a settlement platform. In some cases, this might be the demand response provider, could be considered the recipient of this data. And they're doing calculations, and then the output is for the ISO or potentially the public, depending on the level of transparency needed or expected. So this diagram is just a rough illustration of the data flows of what data is needed and what would happen to it on its way to being an output. In this use case, it's the analysis in the form of a savings load shape or the difference in people's actual load shapes. It's a derivative calculated value. So we're not actually sharing people's actual load shapes, just how their consumption changed. And you'll note it's the non-participant data that's used without consent that is the higher threshold of protection. And this is where we applied differential privacy. So we know individuals and organizations can pose risks as well as the organization itself. And in this diagram, we're basically just appreciating the general risk of an organization and their interests, and assuming that they're also going to have protections for rogue individuals that might be operating within those organizations. So mitigating one rabbit hole there. So once we've established the who and agree that they've generally seemed trustworthy, we wouldn't want to just hand over anything without protections. That would clearly be irresponsible. So the safe settings is really, it establishes what sort of protections are in place for the transfer of the data. And if we look again from left to right, any sharing of the data, the first step in this process is screening that this is a valid use case of the data for a primary purpose, like managing operations of the grid. Any sharing of the data would be protected by NDA and the entity getting the data would have to demonstrate some sort of qualifications to secure and protect that data. SOC 2 certification is one example of that validation. And then finally, NDAs may also be held with the participants and the demand response providers, and this could include provisions for them to share data or also the limitations of them being able to share the data. And privatization, as I noted earlier, in this case is applied to the non-participants down in that right-hand corner, and it's an important setting. We're going to zoom into that in a lot more detail next. After safe settings, we need to talk about the data itself. So in this case, the data itself is primarily energy consumption data, but other metadata is also included that could increase the risk of re-identification. But it's essential to usability in this context. So given what we discussed on the who will be handling the data and who will be seeing the data, some of the threats are re-identification, but there's also just some generic risks of handing data over and holding it in places that might be at risk of attack. And again, I'm not going to dive into every rabbit hole, but this is the space, and the safe data is where you can be considering those issues that need to be managed. So back to our data flow, at the end of the process, we're assuming that ultimately the data is going to the ISO and potentially the full public. So this is where we start thinking about what might be the right level of privacy protection or noise to apply to the outputs to protect them. Or inversely, how much error or noise can we tolerate and still have a usable result? Basically, we have to find a balance point. From left to right, you can imagine we're going to go from a very low privacy factor with high resolution of the impacts to the far right, where we have a high privacy factor but low resolution of the impacts, which might not be very helpful. And this is where the Privacy Explorer tool comes in very handy, because it can help you balance between these different points and understand the trade-offs that are at hand. This is an illustration of the Privacy Explorer, and using it, we can actually look at these discrete trade-offs for maintaining low error in any of the given data sets that we were working with. So imagine a data set with 25,000 individual meters in the population, and they have a low variance in their energy use. The tool allows you to rank different characteristics about the data set. And in addition, it offers a recommended privacy factor for the data set based on the variability within that data. It also has a slider at the top that allows the user to interject noise and see how the privacy factor varies based on how much noise or how much variability you might have in your data set. So in this data set, we have a privacy factor of 5.8, allows us to stay within this 3% error. And we've dubbed this data set one of high social value, just meaning that it has a lot of usefulness for the broader social objectives, but also for the specific grid management objectives that we talked about. So what if we just switched one variable, and instead of having low variance within the data set, we say that it has high variance. Now that just means that individuals within the data set, there's going to be really big users and there's going to be very, very small users. So in this case, in order to continue to protect individuals in that data set and still not go over that 3% error, the privacy factor, the amount of noise, has to be quite a bit higher. The privacy factor that the tool calculated would be more like 16.8 compared to around 6 when we noted same population but low variance. So I realize it's kind of hard to digest what is the right number when you don't yet have an intuitive sense of what a number like a privacy factor is trying to tell you, but that's exactly what the tool is there for. So you can test those boundaries and those assumptions. And you're also probably wondering, well, is that a good number or a bad number? And the next thing you're going to ask is, well, compared to what? So as I told you earlier, that since differential privacy is becoming sort of a mainstream concept, I wanted to share where privacy factors have been set in these other contexts with potentially more or less sensitive data compared to energy consumption. So take, for example, the Google mobility statistics. They're coming in with a privacy factor of about 1.76, and that's on a daily basis. So that means any day that they're processing mobility information, which you can imagine is pretty dynamic, changes every day. The privacy factor that's interjected is 1.76, which is very tight. The other thing to note is that the lower the number, the higher the privacy that is afforded to individuals within the data set. The higher the privacy factor, the lower the protections for individuals, but you might get more usability and more granularity in the accuracy of that data set as well. If you look at the US Census by comparison, which is not a very particularly dynamic data set, they're using values in the range of 4 to 9. So that just gives kind of some heuristics to balance against what a reasonable saving privacy factor might be for different use cases. And in the CAISO study that I related earlier, we applied differential privacy in such a way that the noise that was introduced wouldn't cause more than 5% uncertainty to be interjected into the final statistics. So since we were working with multiple data sets, we don't have one number that came out at the very end. And we also decided that instead of reporting a privacy factor, epsilon in this case, we instead showed it as the maximum amount of KW noise that was in the results. So how much variance could you expect? Because we knew people wouldn't really understand what the differential privacy factor was necessarily telling them. But I can tell you that the privacy factors did vary from single digits for some of the really big data sets, and then in some cases more around double digits, depending when they were smaller data sets with higher variance. And that's just one of the factors of balancing the data sets. The appropriate privacy factor is going to be dependent on the data set that you're working with. So with that, I just want to remind folks that there is, in summary, there's kind of 3 things to take away. We've got these core products, the first being the guide to leveraging differential privacy. It can support decision makers and stakeholders to look at risk and also to consider how differential privacy can be added to their frameworks. We have differential privacy itself, as it were, with there isn't a privacy factor that comes out of it, but rather we have an open source library for practitioners to demonstrate and start communicating and leveraging these practices as they're protecting data sets. And then finally, the Privacy Explorer is a tool that helps us understand the trade-offs and communicate how differential privacy might affect the trade-offs between usability and privacy protections as you work through regulatory conversations. So now let's shift the conversation back to our panelists. And I'm going to start with you, Chris. Given your opening comments and some of the big challenges and opportunities for data access, what kind of stands out to you in your review of the guide or differential privacy in particular that gives you some hope for the future?
So what gives me hope for the future? So one of the big challenges in looking at making data sets like this available has always been sort of a level of risk, and how do you value the risk of re-identifying an individual consumer, whether it's a residential customer or a large industrial factory. And trying then to pigeonhole all of these different factors into one standard just really has never really seemed workable to me. And so being allowed or having a data set and having the slider and being able to shift your privacy factor in a way to see what happens to the data when you introduce noise to the data set or remove noise, to really be able to see what level of risk is really being addressed here, and then how can this privacy factor be used to tolerate risk or increase the tolerance for risk, I think is where there's a lot of value here in bringing it to regulators, because regulators will hear it's either this or that, and here's the one way to do it. And certainly the stuff that I've been working on is there's no one way to do it, because as you said, Carmen, the privacy factor is really dependent upon the data set you're working with. And the data set you're working with is a function of the question and the data being sought. And everyone has different interests and different needs and different data being sought for different purposes. And one of the challenges with the regulation is how do you craft a framework in such a way that allows data to get out into the hands of the people who can use it and use it well, while also erecting appropriate while also recognizing there are people who may make use of those rules for other purposes. And having a methodology to ensure that regardless of your reason for getting the data, you can get a data set that has a higher probability of not being able to re-identify an individual, but also get the data out in a useful way to support people who are asking for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chris or David, do you have, or excuse me, Michael or David, do you have any additions to that?
Yeah, I would just, I would hit on the same point I made before. Just, I mean, these folks don't realize it, but it's fairly obvious when you pointed out that service providers can't even figure out what they can offer or who they can offer it to unless they have that information. So this is really about ways to get out information that's helpful for them to figure out what services to offer customers would be point number one. And that's what's encouraging to me. So I guess I'll stop there. I had some other points that aren't directly responsive to the question.
If we'll get
Carmen,
around to those.
If I can just chime in, I think what David points out is really important. We're talking about the reliability of the power grid and the cost that consumers pay. And like in a demand response context, these are like central societal objectives to decarbonizing the power system. And so this is not like, just an arcane like mathematical discussion. This is like touches on the core issues that regulators are facing. And just to make this example more concrete, think about a smart thermostat program, and you might have thousands of smart thermostats across, let's say, the state of California that goes through a heat wave, and the thermostat company, whoever that is, might not know or want to go through the process of determining every individual's energy usage, right? Any household's energy usage with their permission. They might just want to say, show us in aggregate when we did an event of a certain type on July 7th, when the heat wave was coming and the solar panels were obscured by a lot of wildfire smoke and things like that. Show us the results so that we can continuously improve our product. And I feel like differential privacy is trying to address this in a way that gets the useful information to the entrepreneurs and innovators who are going to be helping develop these solutions and reducing costs on the power grid as a whole, but without necessarily getting the consent of every 500,000 households across California in order to do that. So this is kind of like, to me, this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the public utility and the privacy trade-offs.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I also want to call out in the Q&A, someone did ask about what do we mean by noise? And the four of us are probably not the math wizards that are going to be able to answer that question, but you can get to the differential library on the EDP website. I'll put that in the chat as well. But this is more of the higher level conversation of how it can be applied, and then there's a lot of practitioners and technicians that are capable and able to work through the details of how you're actually injecting that noise and applying that technique. Okay, great. Let's move on to the second question then. And this one's for you, David. Risk and usability of data can really be a complicated conversation, as you kind of pointed to earlier. What do you think we can do to make the value of techniques like differential privacy more accessible so they can be understood as an important part of the solution set?
Yeah, first you keep saying it's just one tool, but as I read the guide, I saw it as a spectrum of tools rather than, it is a big spectrum. So I didn't read it as, a singular tool, but a variety of approaches to solve the problem. What I do when I'm working with regulatory staff and commissions on these data issues is I say, look, don't get drawn down into the details of how to design software and how the AMI data is going to flow into your your various database systems and then outward to those systems. That's for the software engineers and the outside vendors, and it's relevant, but don't get drawn down to that. It really is helpful if you focus on the functionalities you want to see for what that data, how it will be used, and what you're trying to essentially enable. Are you trying to enable research? Researchers doing the work as California has prioritized on, that's one use. So you're trying to enable municipalities getting access to building to work on their municipal building codes, which is another use. Or are you trying to make that data available to solar companies and storage companies that are looking at various load shapes and how to modify those? Those are just three potential uses of the data, or any variation of that. And what the guide does is a nice job of laying out at least the approaches that are taken by 5 different states in that regard for what you call use cases. I think of those as functionalities. They're sort of different sides of the same coin, but think about how the functionality, and that's a good sort of social science approach to it, right? I mean, they're functional anthropologists, they're functional sociologists. They're thinking about the functions as sort of a very practical way that makes it animated for those commissioners and staff who, again, are trying to figure out, well, how am I going to deal with this very complicated set of things in front of me?
Mm-hmm. Chris or Michael, you've lived through many regulatory proceeding. What are your thoughts?
Chris, I'll start if you don't mind. I just think it provides a lot of detail that has been missing from a lot of these debates that tend toward sort of indulging fear and worst outcome type of scenarios. So the big brother fears that I think are reasonable, and I sympathize with them in terms of people or the government knowing what you're doing in your household. Those are real concerns, but it can go off. It has a tendency to go off into irrational territory sometimes, and I feel like this provides some real specifics that in a productive way that I could imagine energy efficiency or demand response programs being informed by this. Bringing in, epsilon factors, thoughtful analysis, using this report, and those different program implementers could go to the regulator and say, here's how we're going to handle this. This is how we can, balance the need for innovation with privacy. Specifically, here's how we're going to address it. And now we'd like your approval. That just feels a much more productive terrain to me than sort of, letting the imagination run wild.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll agree with, not to disagree with Michael, because I agree with Michael, but I want to just follow up with something that David was talking about around trying to make it easy for staff to understand what these trade-offs are. Because, staff are not going to be privacy experts on this, and trying to have staff wind their way through the differing perspectives being raised by market participants, consumer advocates, privacy advocates, utilities, and anyone else who has an opinion on this, end-use customers, really makes it more challenging to come up with, an answer, and just ends up throwing more smoke into the way of allowing the regulator to figure out what to do. And part of the question, I think, also comes down to the answer of what extent is the regulator responsible for behavior. So, we have the world of consent over here, where the consumer must consent in order to have data be shared. And then we have this other world over here of aggregated anonymized data. And you have an entity sometimes who claims to be acting on behalf of the utility, or on behalf of the consumer. Oops, I gave it away. And claiming that they are the ones who are out there protecting the customer's privacy, and therefore only they are the ones that can make the decision on what type of aggregated data can or cannot be made available. And having a model, or at least a mathematical set of formulas developed over a framework, I think allows the regulator to better understand what is that risk of data being made available, how much of it can actually be made available, and how can other public policies be supported by making more data available that can be made available without customer consent without violating customer privacy. And seeing this in practice, I think is what becomes more important at this point to get regulators and staff to start buying into this is how does this actually work in practice? How can they have some level of assurance that this methodology will work, that this will minimize the risk to customer re-identification and protect customer privacy while allowing data to get out and be useful for people who want data and provide additional services and value to the system.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I'm not seeing other questions from the audience, so I'm going to go for my last question then, and then happy to entertain other thoughts as well. Are there any, and this one's for you, Michael, we'll start with you. Are there any jurisdictions that you'd characterize as using best practices on data access or perhaps are headed in the right direction? And in particular, where you think differential privacy might already fit or could really help them overcome barriers?
Yeah, so I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of our advocacy is around consent, permission-based exchanges of individual, household or business energy information, and I'll just park that for now and not talk about that because that's a whole webinar unto itself. But as far as best practices on the sort of aggregated or anonymized or unconsented data, I sort of look at this in two different areas. The first is states that have aggressive energy efficiency or demand management targets in state policy. And these are the ones that, like the Californias and Massachusetts and others, where they're really coming up against some hard cost effectiveness issues, where like a lot of the proverbial low hanging fruit has been captured with energy efficiency, and as some things start to get more expensive in terms of customer acquisition and just the measures themselves becoming more expensive, I think there's a huge role here for targeting and some sort of combination of maybe you have an energy efficiency contractor that's working with a utility under a utility program that has access to at least like where are the high value customers based on an analysis of their energy usage trends, and that that could be done in such a way that hides some of that those detailed information about an individual home from that contractor, but at the same time doesn't waste their time, knocking on the doors of 10 different households where they're just not a good fit for the program in question. So I think there's a lot of states that are in that category where that they would just benefit hugely from the type of masking that differential privacy provides. And the second case that I think is really is going to be a much bigger deal over the next, say, 5 years has to do with the heterogeneity of data, so going just beyond kilowatt hours used, that's provided by a new generation of smart meters. And so there's smart meters getting deployed now that run Linux, and that you can do high frequency statistical disaggregations inside the computer on the meter. And so by sampling it many thousands of times per second, the energy usage profiles, you could potentially identify unique devices or appliances in the home. And that's excellent from a targeting and demand management perspective. If you're trying to keep, as we decarbonize the energy the energy system, you want to keep costs as low as possible for consumers. That's like the equitable and the right thing to do. But we can't be, we don't want to be hobbled in attaining some of those demand response dispatchable resources just because we have, a sense of, well, we can't share any of this information at all because there's a privacy violation. And so I think when you start, looping in not just kilowatt hour usage patterns, but also insights about what is maybe happening in people's homes, who has such and such type of heat pump, who has such and such type of a, chest freezer that's really old and needs to be upgraded, and so on and so forth. That's where I think differential privacy approaches could be really helpful in masking some of the most intimate details of what happens in people's homes.
Interesting. Chris or David.
So I'll start and say that, and I'll say that the state that I will routinely fall back upon as the model for developing a framework is going to be California. And part of it is, yes, because I was staff that oversaw the development of that rule. But what I wanted to point out is a different part of the California PUC orders on data access, which is, I think the third order developed a protocol and a process by which anyone could request an aggregated data set from the utilities. And the California Commission developed a process by which that request is supposed to go through. The end result of that is, if the data is to be made, it can be made available through whatever available aggregation methodologies one agrees upon, then the presumption is that that data should then be made available to everyone. So where you have an application differential privacy that then is developed and you have the process go through with a utility like, say, PG&E, that has applied differential privacy to a data set, then that data set under the California rule is available to everyone. Anyone can then go and get it because it is past the muster of it being available without customer consent. So I think it certainly could be applied today under the existing California processes. Then going forward, I think what I'll build on a bit of what Michael's talking about is there still is a lot there. Most states have no data privacy rules put in place today. And I think the ability to build these concepts into data privacy and data access frameworks being developed today and into the future by the states, I think that's a really important component that we should be looking at, is building in these presumptions and expectations around the availability of aggregated data consistent with practices as developed and detailed in this differential privacy guidebook.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I agree with that point, and I'll pick up there. I just want to observe, I was an environmental regulator before I was on the PUC. There's a large tendency in our culture to assume that your status quo is zero risk. It's not. I mean, the status quo of the utilities having the data, whether some manage it better than others, is not zero risk. There are data breaches from utilities now. We know that, at least I know that. And some of them are rather large. And at least the one I'm thinking of was not disclosed to the customers, to my knowledge. So, I mean, the status quo is not zero risk, and this tool can be helpful there. And the society we live in, we have Amazon, Google, Facebook. Well, a lot of people are mining data about us every day. That is sort of the status quo. So, thinking about how to manage it more protectively, it's privacy can't realistically shut that down, no matter how hard we try. And we're not, if sometimes this area moves into what folks call cyber risk, which is a parallel but related area. And all I'd say there is, if the NSA or the KGB or the Russians want your data, they're going to get it. We do not build any of our systems sufficiently, if you're anywhere on the grid, to protect against that type of risk. So that's not what we're talking about here. That's just that's unfortunate. We're talking about trying to protect at what I'd call moderate levels of risk. I was in the military, and I had access to a lot of classified information. There are ways that you protect highly classified information, but that's not the utility world. That's simply not what we're doing here. So we're talking about reasonably managing structures to reasonably manage this and facilitate and use, I should say, the data that's already available and not really being used to provide value to customers. And that is a concept that commissioners get. I've had multiple commissioners say to me, we paid for these meters. Customers paid a lot of money for these meters. We want to use them. And so that, literally is sort of what we're talking about here, are structures where we can use the data while providing reasonable protections for customer privacy in the context of our modern society, but really provide the services that customers want. I mean, I mean, everyone weighs their privacy differently, and some people probably don't click on share my information on most apps on their phone, and that's their decision. But if I for one would appreciate load aggregators coming to me now from what I know and offering me services. They don't yet. We haven't gotten that right yet, but this is a pathway to get there, and that's why I'm optimistic. One last point I would say is that some of the solutions that you're working on as we were waiting to join this call, I was asking Carmen about the work she's done with DR in California. The solution of aggregating and providing actual data rather than counterfactual baselines is a massive improvement on the way that we do DR in this country under the protocols that the FERC has put in place that rely on counterfactual baselines that are readily subject to manipulation. So this is good stuff. It has the potential to really advance how we do business in the energy world in a lot of areas, and I'm very optimistic about it.
Great. Cool. There is one other question on the chat here from Ed Murray, and he says, has any thought or process been established for application of red team activities to test and demonstrate the effectiveness and limits of differential privacy? It seems that it could serve to solidify confidence in differential privacy, as well as perhaps identifying bugs needing to be fixed. I think that's a great suggestion. In the guide, there are some examples of how you might want to create a review team to understand how well differential privacy is working. That might be kind of a regulatory oversight board of some sort, so you can infuse some of that technical expertise. But really what you're talking about is just hitting those data sets, see if they can be breached, et cetera. And I don't have a discrete example of that, but I know that we do that as a regular practice as a software company. And I would expect it to kind of apply in this case too. Panelists, do you have other thoughts on that?
So what I think that is something that would be, in my mind, reasonable and prudent for an implementer to look at. But what it also brings to mind is something that David brought up at the beginning of his conversation, which is the risk tolerance is not static over time. David noted that when he started with his cell phone, he didn't allow the phone to monitor where he is, and then he found a day that he needed it, and now he allows it. The California rules on data aggregation and process were explicitly stated to not be set in stone, that they are to be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. And so similarly with something like differential privacy, the settings and the assumptions, as sort of Ed is pointing out here, those can't be fixed either. That this is an evolutionary area that is going to be constantly changing, and it requires, I want to say vigilance, because we don't really want to go into the cyber world so much, but our assumptions do need to be tested regularly. Our models need to be tested regularly, and to the extent that we do a better job of allowing data to go through differential privacy screen that can make more data available, then prior assumptions on what aggregation methodologies are should also be evolving over time as technology advances and allows us to have greater capabilities to make more and more data available without infringing on customer privacy.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you all. We're about at time. I want to give folks a chance for any last words or thoughts before we say goodbye.
My thoughts are, I'd like to see more, but this is a really nice start. But I'm really looking forward to seeing the additional work you're doing. Great. And that's all of you. That's you all.
Great. Chris or Michael, any parting words?
I'll just say that, the report is for me sort of fills this really important void, at least on a quantitative basis, in terms of thinking about risk. And so I, kind of like what David mentioned, I've even when I pick it up now and read it again, it has some really great stuff in it that I want to be able to take to other states in our advocacy. So let's do this. Let's make this happen. I think there's, for any state looking at these issues, you should have two tracks. You should have a permission-based track that figures out how to, share your data with permission to access some of these new innovative energy management services. And there should be a sort of, masked, unconsented, obscured pathway that uses a lot of the learnings from the report.
And then I'll only add that the materials in the report, as Michael noted, provides a lot of really good information into a gap in the conversations around availability of aggregated data. Because we've always sort of assumed that there's some mathematical way to address aggregation beyond, sort of these crude methodologies. And now that we have a document that sort of describes how it can be implemented and how a regulator may want to think about it, really does fill an important gap in this conversation. And so I think using this information, introducing to regulators and utilities and consumer advocates, perhaps most importantly in this regard, I think would be a really valuable use of these materials.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining today, and for our panelists, and also for all the technical advisory group members that might be out there in the audience or beyond who contribute to this work. And as David notes, there's more to be done. And stay tuned on the EDP Recurve website. You'll see updates. You can get access to all the information that we presented today. And we'll also have the recording posted there shortly, as well as on our YouTube channel. So with that, I'll thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.